All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We're continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We are on Chapter 16, They Came from the Projects. That was December 2010. By March, the last Cabrini Tower had been stripped of every window, door, and cabinet. The steel curtains covering the ramps were yanked off and carted away. The 15-story high-rise looked exposed, like a giant dresser without any drawers. On a frigid evening, 100 people huddled in the field below. They were gathered to commemorate the end. The demolition of 1230 North Burling would begin in the morning. Behind the crowd, to the east, in the real estate running to the Gold Coast and Lake Michigan, the sunset played off the glass and steel towers. Above them, the twilight passed through the skeleton of the Burling building. They could also see a man inside the tower, his movements revealed by the yellow vest he wore and the horn of light extending from his headlamp. There he was, alone in what might have been a friend's apartment, and now he was on one of the upper floors, beneath ceiling fans sent whirling by the wind. His name was Jan Tichy, and he was a conceptual artist and professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. On his commute to the Art Institute in recent years, he'd passed the, quote, infamous, end quote, housing project, witnessing the late stages of its erasure. Tichy's art tended to wrestle with architecture as a site of social and political conflict, and he proposed to the CHA a live art installation in the last Cabrini high-rise. It would be a way to memorialize the disappearing icon. To his surprise, officials at the agency loved the idea. For his project, Cabrini-Green, Tichy partnered with local after-school programs, and their students contributed poems about the housing development. Jada Jones wrote in, quote, trapped, end quote. What they called hell, we had named home. On the streets where children were once found, transformed by evening to brutal battlegrounds, that's where we belonged. Tichy recorded the students reading their words, and he translated the syncopatations of their voices into flashes of lights, blinkering LED circuits that he placed inside 134 ammo boxes painted a bright orange, one box for each 1230 North Burling apartment. Tichy planned for the lights to run on a loop throughout the 30-day demolition, or until they were destroyed by the wrecking ball. All of this will be filmed from a camera set up on a balcony of one of the parkside of Old Town apartments across Division Street. Dual images, along with audio of the children reading their poems, will play simultaneously on a website and at the Museum of Contemporary Art, just a mile east of the building. It seemed only fitting that the passing of high-rise Cabrini-Green would be turned into an art and idea. The development had long existed in both the solid state of concrete and steel, and in the vaster realm of abstraction, evoked as shorthand to convey a certain idea of the inner city. Just 3 weeks earlier, a primetime network crime drama called The Chicago Code aired an episode it named, quote, Cabrini-Green, end quote. Ronan Gibbons, a character on the Fox series played by Delroy Lindo, is a Cabrini-Green native who has lifted himself up to become both alderman and syndicated crime boss. The real-life alderman of the neighborhood, the Cabrini native with the bank robbery in his past, Walter Burnett, joked about any likeness. Quote, you know the character grew up in Cabrini. It's insulting. At least give me some kind of royalty, end quote. In voiceover, Gibbons describes his childhood at the Near North Side housing project, how people, quote, deteriorated, end quote, along with the high-rises, personal squalor matching that of the physical environment. Quote, I made it my mission to see that prison torn down, end quote, he says, as the episode chronicles, with surprising accuracy, the many ways the city's public housing went wrong, the lack of funding, the loss of rent-paying residents, the 18,000 people living on 70 acres, more than 2/3 of them children. The demolition of Cabrini-Green, Gibbon goes on, quote, showed me there was hope. Hope that a kid from the streets could rise up and be an instrument of change, end quote. Excuse me. As we hear his soliloquy, we watch a murder that Gibbons has ordered on another black kid from the streets, someone who happened to cut into his profits. In the city's churn, the war on anything considered blight, There are always going to be winners and losers. Quote, today is a great day, end quote, the alderman declares. Quote, the first day of a better Chicago. Some of those at the vigil outside 1230 North Burling that night shared the sentiment of the fictional alderman, believing that the event marked the end of a failed 50-year public enterprise, a long overdue exorcism of inner city horrors. Quote, this is really the final high-rise, end quote, a CHA official who joined the ceremony announced triumphantly. Quote, the legacy with the gallery-style public housing is a final farewell, end quote. Photographers for the National Public Housing Museum, which was still struggling to raise funds to open its museum of, quote, stories, end quote, and, quote, ideals, end quote, on the site of the former Jane Addams homes a couple of miles south, were out there capturing the moment. So, too, were crew members from the Cabrini-Green documentary, 70 Acres in Chicago. One of them lowered a boom mic in front of another CHA employee who was describing the deal the agency had struck that week with the retailer Target to build a 190,000 square foot store on the site of the cleared William Green homes. He said the Target would bring jobs to the Cabrini-Green residents who remained in the row houses and the surrounding mixed income buildings. But many residents didn't see the trade-off as a net gain. Quote, people got dispersed for a Target, end quote, a tenant leader asked, his voice going high-pitched with incredulity. I'm pronouncing that wrong. I know how to say that word. I'm messing it up. My fault. Quote, all of this, end quote, he swept his arms, taking in the expanse of empty land where thousands of people had lived. Quote, for a Target, end quote. As night fell, Jane Tichy was still moving through the tower, rechecking that the boxes housing the LEDs were fastened tightly to whatever secure things he could find in the stripped apartments. Electrical outlets, light sockets, heating pipes. Most everything in the units had been removed, though traces of the lives spent there remained. A painting of a black dreadlock Jesus, an elaborate mural of a giant Bugs Bunny alongside a wizardly Mickey Mouse and a whirling Tasmanian devil, each of the characters holding blunts the size of their arms, their heads in the clouds of smoke and eyes turned red. In a bedroom, a single piece of white paper was still taped to the cinder block. It was a list scrawled in red marker, quote, the 7 keys to success, end quote. Among them, quote, set and achieve goals, end quote, make wise choices, end quote, and, quote, be persistent, end quote. In another apartment, a green and gold mural covering an entire wall stated, quote, I need money, end quote. While the people in the parking lot below waited for the start of Project Cabrini-Green, the marching band from the Marion Nzinga Stamps Youth Center arrived. The flag-waving majorettes stepped crispy heel to toe, the tack-tack clap of the drums and cymbals ringing the air. The dancers spun as a boy on drums shouted a command. Everyone in the brigade dropped low, their bent legs swaying like butterfly wings. Then the LEDs started dancing from the cavities of the high-rise. It was like stealing a peek inside 134 still-occupied homes, Nighthawks in each planted in front of a television, the flickering sets washing the darkened rooms in their glow. And that brings us to changing of things within this chapter. And I think what stands out the most in this passage that we read is the statement, all of this for a Target, or they destroyed all these homes for a Target, because that is often how gentrification works, is that the place that people once called home, the place that people once grew up and had all these memories at, that coffee shops and retail stores and movie theaters end up being there, or highways and streets end up being there, or stadiums end up being there. And also, there's also homes that end up being there, and the people who end up being in those homes and the people who end up being able to shop at those retail stores and go to those stadiums are people from a completely different walk of life than the people who were once there. And the people who are benefited from these stores and from these stadiums and from movie theaters and the highways that are put there are, again, people from a completely different walk of life. It's not the people who were displaced who get any type of benefit, or who get advantages from these changes. Annie Ricks. For a couple of weeks, the media followed Annie Ricks and her family to Wentworth Gardens, eager to tell the next chapter in the life of the last Cabrini-Green high-rise tenant. Annie's new apartment was on the second floor of a 3-story walk-up, part of attached buildings that formed a horseshoe around a shared courtyard. During the news interviews, the boys who hung outside tried to angle their way into the camera shots as Rose Ricks shooed them away. Quote, "My family from Cabrini-Green made history," end quote, Annie would proclaim. Quote, "We made nationwide history," end quote. But the attention waned and the reporters stopped calling. Annie's 20-year-old son, Reggie, liked to tease her, nodding his elastic face as he addressed his mother by her middle name. Quote, "You used to be popular, Jeffrey," end quote. Quote, "I am popular, Reggie Lee Ricks," end quote, she chided playfully. Quote, "God loves me," end quote. Like many of the people who relocated elsewhere, Ricks regularly traveled back to Cabrini-Green. She was one of those gathered outside 1230 North Burling on the eve of its demolition. Her daughter Latasha drove her, and her son Kenton snapped photos as Ricks watched roosting geese and a rabbit scurry over the cleared fields. On another day, she spent time with family members in the remaining row houses. She dropped into Carol Steele's office or tracked down Joe Peary in his Parkside of Old Town building. At the end of the school day, her son Raekwon usually took the bus, not to Wentworth, but to Cabrini-Green, playing basketball at Seward Park. Some relocated parents enrolled their children in Jenner or Manier, another local elementary, having them ride a bus and train rather than put them in schools in their new neighborhoods. Others met up with friends at the row houses, hanging on Cambridge. Better there than an unfamiliar strip of Austin, Inglewood, or South Shore. At a town hall meeting for those displaced by the plan for transformation, former Cabrini residents talked about the dangers in their unfamiliar neighborhoods. Quote, "My grandchildren can't even go outside and play in their so-called new community since they received their Section 8 apartment," end quote, a woman told the crowd at St. Joseph's. Quote, "They are having gang wars all around this city when a new face comes on the block. So that is why my grandchildren come back to Cabrini to play with the people they know and the people who know them," end quote. Former residents also got together for, quote, "old school," end quote, picnics and reunions. Several Cabrini-Green Facebook pages formed, people reporting job opportunities and business ventures, sharing words of inspiration and announcements of deaths in the Cabrini family. Oftentimes, a post showed a photo of one of the high-rises, quote, "Who can say what building this is," end quote, leading to lists of competing memories. There was nostalgia, but more than that as well. No one forgot that they'd seen a dead body or that the elevator was too often out of order, but they remembered the good, too, more powerfully now that they felt adrift somewhere else. The Ricks family's first days at Wentworth Gardens were promising enough. With all coverage about the end of Cabrini-Green and its last tenant, many people recognized them from the news. An older woman, upon meeting Annie, said, quote, "Hey, you're the lady on Channel 7 with that one tooth," end quote. Quote, "Yes, I am," end quote, Ricks responded proudly, and they became friends. 10 other Cabrini families have relocated there as well, including Donna, the mother of J.R. Fleming's first 4 children. They all welcomed the Rickses. When winter ebbed, Annie barbecued out in the courtyard, a communal feast. At nights during the summer when the White Sox hit home runs, she sat in the window with her grandchildren and pointed to the fireworks from the exploding scoreboard that lit up the sky. Wentworth Gardens was built in the 1940s on 4 square blocks next to the White Sox Stadium, and like other public housing developments with, quote, "garden," end quote, in their names, it offered a promise of a verdant, planted community, with parks and lawns replacing the alleys and littered streets of the slums. But it, too, deteriorated as maintenance lagged. Apartments flooded, sewage backed up, and heating systems failed. When the plan for transformation got underway, Wentworth was given an extensive rehab. The units were modernized with new kitchens and bathrooms. The grounds were again landscaped. The parking lots expanded. Wrought iron fencing now ringed the perimeter. All of that was good to Annie, but she also pointed out that the downstairs door to her building was broken. Even though it was locked, people just yanked it open. The buzzer in the apartment didn't work either. She was assured that these problems would be fixed. She wanted to remain upbeat, even though with no laundry hookup, she now had to drag a cart to a separate laundry building. And despite the demands she made while holding out in 1230 North Burling, Ricks was located to an apartment with only 3 bedrooms. She slept in one of the rooms, Rose and her baby in another, and Reggie and his son stayed in the third. Raekwon, the youngest, was like Michael Evans from Good Times, the little fellow who slept on the couch. In quote, okay, end quote, she said, quote, we'll make this work, end quote. She quickly learned that Wentworth was plopped down in the middle of a food desert. When the new White Sox Stadium was built next to the old one in 1991, it replaced much of the surrounding neighborhood, clearing homes as well as local businesses and the jobs they provided. Give me 1 second here. I think I'm having some audio. The closest supermarket when she moved there was nearly 2 miles away. Most residents did their shopping at a gas station and liquor store on the south end of the development. One of Rick's daughters sometimes drove her to a grocery store, but Annie liked to walk, so she also headed out on her own. Okay, I gotta change the batteries, I think. Okay, had some audio issues. Let's try to figure out where we left off at. The closest supermarket when she moved there was nearly 2 miles away. Most residents did their shopping at a gas station and liquor store on the south end of the development. One of Rick's daughters sometimes drove her to a grocery store, but Annie liked to walk, so she also headed out on her own. She journeyed south a couple of miles to shop at Jewel or Walgreens. She trekked another half mile beyond that to visit an aunt in a senior center, and sometimes she went by foot to Oakwood Shores, a rehab public housing complex near the lakefront where some of her cousins lived. Ricks now cursed herself for not deciding where she wanted to go rather than letting the CHA pick. Quote, we ended up there because my dumb butt didn't make them put in writing about a 4-bedroom, end quote, she would say. Quote, that was my mistake, end quote. Annie didn't unpack entirely, as if she couldn't accept that Wentworth was her home. In the living room, she hung a photo from her wedding day. There were photos, too, of her deceased mother, who lived to 94, and of Annie's children at their graduations, and 3 pictures of President Obama. A couple of prayers and rules were taped to the wall. Quote, men don't wear hats in the house, end quote, but boxes were stacked unopened. Most of the trophies were never put on display. A bassinet was stuffed with clothes, and a grandfather clock remained taped shut from the day the big, quote, oh, end quote, movers carried it inside. One day, Reggie took stock of their new apartment. Quote, tell you the truth, we downsized, end quote, he told his mother. Annie Ricks couldn't deny it. And so, again, we have another experience of somebody who feels as if they were shortchanged in this plan for transformation, and another person who feels like the area that she's living in is dangerous, and it's just disheartening to think about how many people have went through this reality, and how a lot of these issues, a lot of these things that we're speaking about specifically in this book are just issues of people in power caring about people that are vulnerable and people that are in these situations, and because they don't care, and typically they haven't cared and don't care because the people that are vulnerable are black people, people of color, poor people. These issues just continue to be cyclical. Dolores Wilson. Dolores Wilson didn't return to 1230 North Burling for the vigil. She was in her 80s then and couldn't stand out in the cold for hours looking at a lifeless wreck. She had dizzy spells, trips to the doctor, tests. Quote, the longer you live, the house is going to tear down, end quote, she'd say. Plus, she was still familiarizing herself with the bus routes and the streets around Dearborn Homes. Most Sundays, she did go back to Cabrini. Holy Family Church had a van that picked up its members who'd been scattered around the city, and for a small fee, Dolores also took the Pace bus. She tried to make the 10 o'clock a.m. services and also the Bible classes that followed. Her new neighbors liked to tell Dolores how bad the Dearborn homes used to be. Quote, They said the building I'm in was the worst, end quote, Dolores explained. Quote, it was where the drugs were sold. The police wouldn't come in there. No security, end quote. When it opened in 1950, Dearborn was the first public housing complex in Chicago with elevators. 16 X-shaped buildings of no more than 9 stories with a, quote, towers in the park, end quote, design. In the 1940s and 50s, the CHA designated many of its new developments as, quote, relocation projects, end quote, housing for the tens of thousands of families displaced by highway construction, slum clearance, and other large urban renewal efforts. Under the plan for transformation, Dearborn Homes became a new relocation project, undergoing a multi-million-dollar renovation. Thousands of families left public housing high-rises for a different rehab public housing site. Quote, if I'm at Cabrini and I choose Dearborn Homes, the public housing I'm moving into is nowhere near the public housing I'm moving out of, end quote. Louis Jordan, the head of the CHA from 2007 to 2011 said, quote, people are exercising a choice. They know in the relocation process that they're going to 100% better public housing, end quote. Quote, some choice, end quote, Dolores would crack. When she moved into Dearborn, though, the floors were waxed and the elevators and walls clean. Trees and green grass surrounded the mid-rises. A security guard checked IDs in the lobby. A bus ran along State. Trains were nearby. And the campus of the Illinois Institute of Technology sat just to the south. She did complain about the absence of any stores. The closest grocery den was 15 blocks away. And about the size of her, quote, teeny-weeny, end quote, apartment. Dolores would say of her place that she didn't have room to move around. Quote, the elevator is in my bedroom almost. I can sit in my living room and cook in the kitchen, end quote. She liked that her daughter, Cheryl, my fault. Let me get this cord right. Okay. She liked that her daughter Cheryl lived next to her on the very same floor, and Chi-Chi visited often, and she sometimes looked after her great-grandson, who went to a school next door that she could see from her window. Quote, all he had to do was take the elevator down and cross the street, and it's not even a traffic street, end quote, Dolores would say cheerfully. But the under-enrolled school was one of the 50 shuttered by the city in 2013. From 2000 to 2010, Chicago's African-American population fell by 181,000, a 17% drop, families deciding to quit the troubled city for the southern suburbs or the south. And eventually, Cheryl had enough of Chicago and joined the exodus, moving to Atlanta to be closer to her own daughters. For all those reasons, Dolores couldn't muster the interest to do the little interior decorating that she'd always loved. She couldn't make her, quote, way small, end quote, apartment feel like home. Quote, I'm there, end quote, she'd say. Quote, I'm surrounded by walls, but I'm just walking through, end quote. Dolores says she no longer wanted to get involved in politics and activism, but she'd been saying that her entire adult life. She continued to obsess about prison reform and police abuse, about the number of unsolved murders in the city's black neighborhoods and all the money spent on buildings up the areas near downtown. She called her friends and wrote letters to local papers. She didn't attend the tenant council meetings at Dearborn. It was too far a walk across the development. But when her great-grandson's school was being closed, she went to protest to try to keep it open. Quote, I cannot imagine that they would just relocate children for the benefit of those with money or with political power behind them, end quote, Dolores said. And then she learned that the CHA hadn't fixed up or rented out almost 3,500 of its units, despite the fact that the federal government was still paying the agency whether the units were occupied or not. The CHA had also issued 13,500 fewer vouchers than HUD had funded. With tens of thousands of families on the waiting list for a subsidized rental, and hundreds of thousands more above the public housing threshold but struggling to pay rent on the open market, the CHA built up a reserve of $430 million, claiming it as some sort of rainy day fund, while just about every other city and state agency looked to be in penury. Dolores almost cried, she was so mad. What about the rain that families in need of housing were feeling right now? She came to feel about a new mayor, Rahm Emanuel, the same way she did about the second mayor, Daley. Quote, I hate their natural guts, end quote, she said. She joined a local group whose mission was to engage the Bronzeville neighborhood, her new neighborhood, in, quote, civic capacity, end quote. Quote, "It sounds really elaborate, but it ain't," end quote, Dolores joked. When the group went to Springfield to protest even deeper cuts to social service programs, Dolores rode the bus downstate with her fellow demonstrators. As people marched around the state capitol, they shouted, quote, "What do we want?" End quote. Quote, "When do we want it?" End quote. Dolores waved her fist and yelled the words, thinking at the same time that what she wanted was to sit down and to do it right now. Quote, "Maybe after a while the protesting will pay off," end quote, she said with a sigh. Quote, "Maybe if we keep going, there will be some change," end quote. That brings us to a changing in the theme within the chapter. And Rahm Emanuel, what stands out to me is hearing about Rahm Emanuel. We've made it from the first mayor daily of Chicago all the way to Rahm Emanuel. And almost every mayor that has been in Chicago, if you look up some of their actions and their ideologies and the way that they altered the city, you'll see that the majority of these mayors did things that were discriminatory to black people and people of color, did things that were exploitative to poor people and working class people. And I think that that's one of the things that stands out. A lot of people talk about how corrupt the city of Chicago is, and living in a city that is near Chicago in Rockford, Illinois, a lot of that same corruptness has trickled down to Rockford, Illinois. That same democratic machine has taken root here as well. Dolores had it better than many others who moved away from Cabrini-Green. They dealt with sketchy landlords, out-of-control utility bills, and an unfamiliarity with their surroundings that often put them in the way of danger. The gang structure in Chicago had fragmented into some 850 cliques, small groups of guys who grew up together, their collective identity organized around a corner or a park, the local school, or the slang of a friend. Their clashes with one another were mostly petty, personal, stirred up on social media, the kinds of conflicts that occur when every few blocks a different crew holds sway. Yet with more guns on the streets of Chicago than in New York City and Los Angeles combined, the arguments too often proved deadly. In 2012, Chicago saw 504 homicides, more than in any other city in the country, and the most there since the early 90s. Relocated public housing families were often blamed for the soaring rates of crime. There was an assumption, repeated by community leaders, the police, and homeowners, that the newcomers brought with them their, quote, project behavior, end quote, a lack of socialization, as if they had recreated Cabrini-Greens wherever they settled. In South Shore, which took on more Section 8 renters than any other Chicago neighborhood, a resident described the arrival of high-rise families like a biblical plague. Quote, "It is as if the gates of hell opened and these people were let out. I had to ask again, where did these people come from? And lo, I was told they came from the projects, the CHA," end quote. It turned out the problem families he was describing were not from public housing, but no matter. Sometimes the behavior deemed, quote, ghetto, end quote, wasn't the fault of the voucher holders, but of their landlords. Families had to yell out their apartment windows to check on the door when the buzzers and intercoms were broken, and the request to fix them went unheeded. A police commander who patrolled public housing high-rises before they were torn down said, quote, 90% of the people in there were great people, end quote. It was about perception. Quote, that stigma of the CHA, end quote, he added, quote, breeds the fear, end quote. Experts talked of a tipping point at which, quote, crime would explode, end quote, as more public housing families were relocated to an area. A criminologist from the University of Illinois at Chicago speculated that the dispersal of CHA families had already led to a sharp jump in crime in the city's southern and western suburbs. And people in middle and working class Chatham on Chicago's south side blamed the plan for transformation for their neighborhood's decline. The communities with large numbers of Section 8 landlords, however, were already suffering in post-industrial Chicago. The Loop and the areas around it added 48,000 residents from 2000 to 2010, more than in any other city center in the country. Many black communities, on the other hand, continued to be drained of population, and they became even poorer and more perilous. Then the foreclosure crisis hit. By 2013, Chicago had 62,000 vacant properties, with another 80,000 foreclosures working their way through courts countywide. 2/3 of the vacant homes were clustered as if to form a sinkhole in just a few Black and Latino neighborhoods. 1 of every 5 apartments in South Shore was caught up in a foreclosure, along with thousands of single-family homes. Vacant houses were more likely to be used by bored kids, gangbangers, and drug users. Maps of the city's homicides, foreclosures, and public housing relocations looked almost like perfect overlays of one another. Families from Cabrini-Green and other high-rise developments didn't spread crime like an infectious disease. They were moved into tense areas far from the city center where the poor were already competing over shrinking resources. That also meant relocated families were bound to exacerbate the problems. It would have taken uncommon coordination for the CHA, the police, and the schools to work in tandem on the relocations to avert conflicts. But that's exactly what was required. Quote, "It's like they took all the gains and mixed them up," end quote, said the uncle of a 16-year-old who was shot to death in Inglewood after he was moved from Robert Taylor. Quote, "Every project they shut down, they don't check where they put you, they just put you," end quote. Here, let's finish this. We'll finish this last passage up and then we'll do a reflection before we end the episode. Eric Davis, the Cabrini-Green police officer who was part of the Slick Boys, lived in South Shore, and he now saw people all the time in his neighborhood who'd moved from public housing. They greet him as 21, and they laugh about something in the past that probably wasn't funny when it happened. Davis had retired from the force in 2007 after 20 years on the job, and he refused to set foot over again on the land at Cabrini-Green. He'd show up to meet someone and linger just beyond the periphery of Seward Park, as if repelled by an invisible electric fence. He figured that he and every other police officer, resident, and activist who spent time at Cabrini suffered in some way from post-traumatic stress. His wife would catch him staring into space. Quote, "You in Cabrini, baby?" End quote, she'd ask, touching his arm. He had another reason never to go back. He wanted to preserve the purity of his final days on the job. During the last 2 hours of his very last shift, Davis was called to 1017 North Larrabee, JR's old high-rise. A 25-year-old woman was going into labor. The paramedics told her it was false labor and she had nothing to worry about. Davis had known the woman since she was a child and she demanded to speak to him and only to him. It was her third baby, she said. By now she understood when a baby was coming, and it was coming. Davis agreed to take her to the hospital. The elevator was broken and he held her arm as they walked slowly down each flight of stairs. They made it as far as the lobby. Quote, 21, I'm having my baby, end quote, she said. He got it. He told her. That's why he was taking her to the hospital. Quote, no, she repeated. Right now, end quote. She lay on her back on the floor, slid off her stretchy maternity pants, and told Davis to look. Bracing himself, he kneeled between her legs and saw the melon of the baby's head pushing its way out. Other residents gathered around. By the time Davis got the courage to reach for the emerging form, 100 spectators had filled the lobby. Quote, damn, I didn't know you guys delivered babies, end quote, an onlooker said. The woman spread her legs, wider, and the rest of the baby started to appear. A face, shoulders, wriggling arms. Davis's hands were down there, wet to the elbows. Then, suddenly, miraculously, he was holding a tiny boy. He placed the baby in the mother's arms. Davis had arrested the child's father before, catching him in possession of an unlicensed gun and sending him to the penitentiary. But when the father showed up that night, he embraced Davis like a brother. The mother said she wanted to name the baby Eric after Davis. It was their first boy, though, and they gave him his father's name. But everyone called the child 21. And that brings us to the end of that passage, or the changing of a theme. We only got about, I think we got one chapter left, about 30-something pages left. There's probably only about 2 more episodes. What stands out to, this is a longer episode too, but what stands out to me about what we just read is the helplessness that exists in these communities, that is exemplified by the fact that the same man who facilitated somebody's freedom being taken away from them is the same man who was the only option for this woman to give birth, to help this woman give birth. And I know for people who are supportive of the police, or maybe people who are still trying to understand where they fit in the struggle to police terrorism, that may go to balance out, a good deed to balance out a bad deed or whatever. Or, the police officer arrested this young man, but he also gave birth to the child or helped the child be delivered. But I think what really stands out to me in reading that is how few options these people have. That she called the ambulance and the ER and the paramedics for her to deliver the baby, but they didn't believe her. If this would have been a white woman in a upper class neighborhood or in some condo or in some mansion, they would have trusted that she understood that she was about to have the baby, and she wouldn't have needed the police officer to be the one delivering the child. I think another thing that stands out to me is even at the end of the high rises existing, the elevator still didn't work. She couldn't take the elevator down. She had to take the stairs down. Also, the fact that they didn't take any type of heed to the neighborhoods that they were moving people into, that they didn't take heed to the gang wars that existed. That one of the other things that they said was that it was more guns in Chicago than New York and LA combined in 2012, and that they had the highest murder rate that they had since the 90s in 2012, and this was directly after the destruction of these high rises and the relocation process that these people went to, and that most of these people went into neighborhoods that already were dealing with violence, that was already dealing with a lack of equitable living circumstances. And so this book is really a tragedy, 3 parts of a tragedy. And we're getting, as we get to the end of this, again, I implore people to find out about public housing and the places that you live in and the areas that you're from. And so we'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And if you haven't listened to previous episodes, go back to listen to previous episodes. And if you listen to this and future episodes are out, please go and listen to those future episodes. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.